glad you could join us today on EdFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. Measuring biodiversity, the variety of all living things, is complex. And there's no single measure that can capture all of the changes in this web of life. Nevertheless, the vast majority of indicators show net declines over recent decades. That's because in the last 50 years, our world has been transformed by an explosion in global trade, consumption, and human population growth, as well as an enormous move towards urbanization. Today, the world's wildlife populations have plunged by an average of 68% in just 4 decades, with human consumption behind the decline. On this week's episode of EdFile, we look at why this matters. Just stay with us. Just a few months after Ekpe Fish Market was under lockdown to stem the spread of the new coronavirus, vendors at the site in Lagos are back buying, selling and trading animals. A vendor descales an endangered pangolin with a machete. Nearby, grass cutter rodents are skinned. Most of the sellers wear masks to avoid contracting COVID-19. Experts say COVID-19, which has killed more than 1,000 in Nigeria, jumped from animals to humans, possibly at a wet market in China. But few in Ekpe were worried. Kune Yusuf has been selling wildlife for over 10 years.
I used to sell everything from Chinese and the black people. And the coronavirus that just came in early now. But we didn't afraid about the coronavirus because of the coronavirus is not inside the meat.
University of Cambridge virologist Dr. Olivia Restif called for more education around safe animal trade and hygiene.
We're very concerned with the risk that it poses. But when it comes to what should be done about it, we are very cautious because we are very aware that those markets, and in general, the trade of animals and meat products are very important socially and economically and often culturally.
Chinedu Mogbo, founder of Green Fingers Wildlife Conservation Initiative, a wildlife sanctuary, is at the Ekpe market today to see what wildlife he can take off the sellers. After about an hour of haggling, he's able to pay and secure the safety of just one of the pangolins. He hopes to encourage Nigerians to cut bushmeat consumption and avoid animal-based traditional medicine, which can fuel the unhygienic animal handling that can aid virus transmission. But he has to do this by paying for the animals. Chinedu says paying to save these animals is not the best option, but it remains all he can do until there is a proper education.
It is not the right thing because I know that it will still encourage them to keep getting more of these things because they feel somebody is doing something, is taking them off them and they are benefiting off these things. However, I know that even if I were to reject them or let them go, our country is not a place where the people are educated enough to know that this thing should not be encouraged.
He buys these animals and gives them a new lease to life, by either bringing them to his animal sanctuary or keeping them for a while to heal before releasing them back into the wild. He says apart from going to these wet markets to buy off the animals, he gets called as many as 15 times a day from people who are about to witness the killing of a wildlife, either for food or for traditional medicine purposes.
I believe they would appreciate them more, getting close to see them, coming up close to them to see them. I imagine going to parks, in other countries, and this is what people do.
The World Wildlife Fund said the pandemic should be a wake-up call. But the booming trade at Ekpe illustrated unchanged attitudes despite about 800,000 killed worldwide by the virus. Nigeria is also a hub for illegal wildlife trade to Asia. The World Wildlife Fund said the economic strain of the pandemic has sapped conservation budgets in many countries. 2020 was billed as a super year of climate, biodiversity and sustainable development meetings in which the international community had great plans to take the reins of the Anthropocene. The COVID-19 pandemic has meant that most of these conferences are now scheduled for 2021 and has provided a stark reminder of how nature and humans are intertwined. But this has not stopped some from putting in efforts to save the endangered species. The first Saturday in September each year is International Vulture Awareness Day. Vultures are an ecologically vital group of birds that face a range of threats in many areas that they occur. Populations of many species are under pressure and some species are facing extinction. Across Nigeria, there is a rising demand for vultures, and poachers are driving the local population of 4 large vulture species to near extinction.
They are hard to come by these days. The one that you can find easily these days are the hooded vulture. And I tell you what, the hooded vulture, the decline was so dramatic that at the point in time, it was least concern. It was listed under the IUCN Red List as least concern. Within a few years, it jumped from least concern to critically endangered, to show you how the remarkable decline has happened within just a short time. So it's something that we need to call people's attention to, and so that we will be aware of the harm that we are doing. It may not eventually affect us, but it's going to affect the generation after us. There are no environmental sanitizers who will clean up the environment of diseases. We're exposing the future generation to a situation where we will not find, they will not have the biological control in terms of those diseases.
Lagos State Commissioner for Health, Professor Akin Abayomi, joined the Chief Executive Officer of Lufasi Park, Desmond Majakodimi, another environmental activist and nature conservationist at the Lufasi Park in Lagos to commemorate the 2020 International Vulture Awareness Day. The message is simple.
The ecosystem is a very holistic system. It protects you. You may think that it's a very passive entity. It's not a passive entity. It's dynamic. It's working. It's protecting the environment. It's creating a balance in nature. And where you have an imbalance in nature, then you have the opportunity for pandemics to emerge. So, for example, if you remove certain predators of rodents, then the rodents will expand, and then things like Lassa fever will start to affect the human population. It's just a simple example of where you create an imbalance in the environment and it has human consequences. And so pandemics that we talk about, Ebola, Lassa fever, yellow fever, COVID, Marburg, cholera, monkeypox, they're all signs that the environment and the human balance between the environment and human beings is a bit abnormal. And so by doing things like this, you're trying to restore the balance and to create a level of symbiotic relationship between man and his environment.
And this tree we're planting is a tree that the vultures love to roost in, the eki tree. Eki tree has some unique characteristics that enhances the vulture's capability of surviving in the forest. And one of those characteristics, obviously, is its height. It's a very, very tall tree, one of the tallest trees in the forest. And then the way that its canopy spreads, it has very big, thick branches. And under those branches, you don't have any obscuring canopy. So the vulture can sit on top of that thick branch and see what is going on all around it. And because the branches are nice and thick, the vulture can also put its big nest in one of those hooks in the branches. It is ideal for the vulture. It is so ideal that if the vulture doesn't see that eki tree, it will not nest. And, there are parts of Lagos that do have some very big trees. The vulture will not come there because it doesn't have that particular characteristic that the eki tree offers. They like to come back to the tree before dark. So a good time to see vultures coming to the roost is around 6:30. They'll be there. Then by 7, before it gets dark, they all huddle up on those nice thick branches where they can be safe for the night. If they have a nest, they'll go to the nest. And then early morning, they'll now come out of the tree and start looking for their food. And the eyesight of the vulture is very, very, very powerful. And the sense of smell is also very, very, very strong.
Vultures have had a tough time in the public eye. They're saddled with cultural perceptions relating to death, decay, and maliciousness. On top of this, some species are not renowned for being the prettiest. Vultures are the outcasts, left lacking the compassion that we feel for the plight of the endangered lion, eagle, or panda. In a survey conducted by BirdLife International, 75% of people think of vultures as dirty undertakers. The thought that they circle helpless prey, a common theme. Conversely, these cautious creatures are themselves the ones that are helpless to the threat of human persecution. But vultures are the rarest unsung heroes. You can think of pack of feral dogs, rats, and less efficiently consumed carcasses. How would your local environment look and smell if the garbage disposal team disappeared also? An African safari tour would not be quite the same with hundreds of unconsumed carcasses around.
A vulture in his lifetime does an ecosystem service, what we call an ecosystem service, worth over $11,200 in its lifetime. You could imagine how many vultures are doing that, and you can imagine what it will accrue to the economy of a country. So they play a vital role. But because we think that, they are just there scavenging, we don't know what they do for us. Actually, they do a lot for us. And the danger is that because they are declining, because they are no longer we are no longer found as they used to be, that's where we are trying to cry, let's cry out. These things are going into extinct, and it's going to put the human population in jeopardy.
Experts have conversed for more efforts to combat degradation of forests, which will in turn protect the wildlife and Nigeria's biodiversity.
We try as conservationists to preach sustainable use. Sustainable use is simply put in my professor's language: chop today, chop tomorrow. So you cannot just finish everything at once. You need to be able to take today, and then you have enough to take tomorrow, and also to leave for the future generation. Yeah, that's just sustainability. Is using something that would not jeopardize the future generations' access to those things as well. Yeah, so it also applies to vulture. If we must use them, we should use them sustainably. But sometimes you find in some markets, some vulture markets, you find literally thousands of birds lying down.
Nigeria is a biologically diverse country with good patches of lowland rainforest in the south to semi-desert in the extreme north. As a result of this, there is much of interest for the birder to see. Over the last 3 decades, Nigeria has witnessed unprecedented destruction of its natural resources so that less than 3% of the original rainforest cover now remains, and large areas of savanna woodland in the north have been converted into farmlands. With a growing population, the pressures are unlikely to abate, so that the future survival of the country's fauna resources is likely to be dependent on the maintenance of its 8 national parks and the various game and forest reserves throughout the country. The national parks cover an area of just over 22,000 square kilometers, about 2.5% of the country. So there is a pressing need to upgrade some of the other reserves into parks to ensure that all habitat types are adequately protected within the park system. Unfortunately, most forests and game reserves throughout the country receive little or no protection, so they are being destroyed at an alarming rate. Even in the national parks, poaching levels are a matter of concern, although the habitat in the parks has been largely spared to destruction elsewhere. The poaching pressures throughout Nigeria have led to the demise of many of the larger birds in Nigeria. Apart from birds, it is now almost impossible to see any large mammal outside of the national parks. So if the country is to retain a representative selection of its fauna resources, it is imperative to ensure that the parks are totally protected. The average size of wildlife populations has plummeted by 2/3 worldwide since 1970, as forests were felled to grow food. The World Wildlife Fund warns that harming ecosystems hikes the risk to humans of infectious diseases like COVID-19. land conversion for farming, and the wildlife trade were key reasons for the 68% average drop across thousands of populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish between 1970 and 2016.
It is bad in three ways. First of all, because we have seen a steep decline of two-thirds of wildlife populations in less than 50 years. And this is a blink of an eye compared to the millions of years that many of these species have been inhabiting our planet. Second reason for being worried, this is a negative trend. We've seen this accelerating over the last 20 years. The last Living Planet report was nearly 60%. We are now about 70% now, 68%. And the third reason is because we're beginning to understand that we're losing so much nature, and with it, so many services that are so important for our society. So it's not just an issue for the preservation of the wonderful wildlife that, of course, we all love, we want to protect, we have the moral duty to preserve. It's also a question of self-survival, and we're beginning to see the impact in many aspects of our life. Health, for example, the COVID crisis, but also even in economic terms.
In 2019, tropical rainforests, whose preservation is considered crucial to curbing climate change, disappearing at a rate of 1 football pitch every 6 seconds. The WWF reports on Living Planet, with contributions from about 125 experts, tracked almost 21,000 populations of nearly 4,400 vertebrate species, giving an overview of the state of the natural world. Those that live in freshwater suffered an 84% decline. Other worst-hit wildlife included eastern lowland gorillas in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the African grey parrot in Ghana.
So it is very serious, and that's what needs to change. Instead of being sad about nature loss or extinction of wildlife decline, we should be worried, and that should trigger action.
All the world's governments have fallen short on pledges made a decade ago to protect wildlife, though cases of conservation show that the destruction of nature can be slowed and even reversed. A new United Nations report outlined recommendations for far-reaching changes in sectors from farming to urban planning and a rapid phase-out of the fossil fuels driving climate change to help save 1 million species scientists say are at risk of extinction. The UN report underlines the need not just for stronger commitment in stemming a precipitous decline in wildlife, but also in seeing those commitments through. The United Nations is pushing for government to collectively set aside 30% of the planet's land and sea areas for conservation when they meet in 2021 in China to negotiate a new wildlife pact. Currently, about 17% of the world's land falls into areas that receive some form of protection. Scientists have said the world may need more than 30% to survive, if not thrive.
We're losing biodiversity. We're losing species at a historical rate. Potentially 500,000 to 1 million species are threatened with loss. We've lost much of our native forests, much of our native wetlands, and effectively biodiversity needs to be considered as an equally important issue as climate change. It's not just an environmental issue. It is an economic issue, a development issue, a security issue, a social, moral and ethical issue. The time for action clearly is now.
The UN report assessed 20 goals known as Aichi biodiversity targets, brokered within a global pact in Japan in 2010. Those goals aim, for example, to slow deforestation, preserve wetlands, and raise public awareness of the importance of nature to a healthy planet. None of the main targets had been met. However, there were signs of progress. For example, while global deforestation was not reduced by the goal of at least 50%, it did slow by about a third over the last 10 years relative to the previous decade. And while a third of marine fish stocks were overfished, a higher proportion than a decade ago, stocks have bounced back quickly in areas where protections were put in place. The authors warned that conservation goals are still being undermined by subsidies supporting industrial agriculture, fishing, and other businesses that damage ecosystems. Last year, the International Panel of Scientists on Biodiversity said that 1 million species are at risk of extinction unless countries can prioritize conservation.
If you think of somebody having a really serious disease, which would be the symptoms which is most critical? Which of the analyses from the lab will be the most worrying? Actually, none on its own. All the analyses together compose a picture, and the whole picture, the whole consistent picture, the way they interact with others is the bad news or the good news.
The 2019 Global Assessment Blood Language echoed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a parallel UN-backed panel which said in October that profound changes in modern economies and societies will be needed to curb greenhouse gases quickly enough to avert the most devastating consequences of a warming world. The assessment shows a planet in which human footprint is so large it leaves little space for anything else. 3/4 of the land-based environment and about 66% of the marine environment have been significantly altered by human activities. More than 1/3 of the world's land surface and nearly 75% of freshwater resources are now devoted to crop or livestock production. The value of agricultural crop production has increased by about 300% since 1970. Raw timber harvest has risen by 45%, and approximately 60 billion tons of renewable and non-renewable resources are now extracted globally every year, having nearly doubled since 1980.
So there's no question we have to start to put emphasis on getting rid of harmful subsidies, promoting good practice, sustainable consumption and use, and effectively recognise the importance that nature is an asset to be managed carefully.
Land degradation has reduced the productivity of 23% of the global land surface. Up to $577 billion in annual global crops are at risk from pollinator loss, and between 100 and 300 million people are at increased risk of floods and hurricanes because of loss of coastal habitat and protection. In 2015, 33% of marine fish stocks were being harvested at unsustainable levels. 60% were maximally sustainably fished, with just 7% harvested at levels lower than what can be sustainably fished. Urban areas have been more than doubled since 1992.
There is no doubt that this is certainly the most comprehensive report ever written, with an incredible amount of detail. But at the same time, we should recognise that the basic message is the same as what the scientific community has been saying for more than 30 years. Biodiversity is important in its own right. Biodiversity is important for human well-being, and we humans are destroying it.
Plastic pollution has increased tenfold since 1980. Between 300 and 400 million tons of heavy metals, solvent, toxic sludge and other waste from industrial facilities are dumped annually into the world's waters. And fertilizers entering coastal ecosystems have produced more than 400 ocean dead zones, totaling more than 245,000 square kilometers, a combined area greater than that of the United Kingdom. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in millions of years. The way we produce and consume food and energy, and the blatant disregard for the environment entrenched in our current economic model has pushed the natural world to its limits. COVID-19 is a clear manifestation of our broken relationship with nature. It has highlighted the deep interconnection between nature, human health, and well-being, and how unprecedented biodiversity loss threatens the health of both people and the planet. Wildlife experts are advising us that it is time we answer nature's SOS, not just to secure the future of all the amazing diversity of life we love and have the moral duty to coexist with, but because ignoring it also puts the health, well-being, and prosperity, and indeed the future of nearly 8 million people at stake. That's our program for today. Thank you for staying tuned. We hope to be back with you next week. In the meantime, our inbox, edfile@channelstv.com, is available for your comments and your questions. From all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.